Hello everyone and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation. Today we'll be exploring an important topic brought to you by continuous learning development. This is the first slide, and it's just to set the stage. Over the next few minutes, we'll cover key insights and strategies that can make a real difference. So let's get started. Today, let's explore the meaning of the Arabic word hukum. In its literal sense, hukum simply means command. But when we look at it from a technical perspective, it takes on a slightly different meaning, that of a rule. And this rule can be of many kinds, but here, our main focus is on the legal rule, which is known as Hukum Shari or Islamic law. Hukum Shari, in its literal sense, refers to a rule of Islamic law. But what's important to understand is how this rule comes into being. It's not just any rule. It's formed through the operation of three essential elements, which are called arkan. These elements are fundamentally interconnected. First, we have the hakim, or the lawgiver, and that is Allah Almighty Himself. Second, there's the mahkum fi, which is the act or the matter on which the hukum operates. And third, we have the mahkum, alay, which refers to the subject or the person to whom the hukum is applied. Understanding these components helps us see how Islamic law functions as a comprehensive system based on divine authority, specific actions, and the individuals involved. This connection emphasizes the divine origin of the rules and their application within the community. Let's begin by understanding what Hukum Shari really means. The Muslim jurists define Hukum Shari as a communication from Allah, the Exalted. This communication relates to our actions, and it can come in different forms. Sometimes it's a demand, like a command that we must follow, or an option, giving us choices, or simply a declaration, which states a fact or ruling. Now, it's important to realize that Hukum Shari isn't just one single thing. It falls into two main categories. The first is Hukum Taklifi, which creates obligations. Think of it as the rules that tell us what we must do or what we are forbidden from doing. The second is Hukum Wadi, which is more about declarations. These are rulings that clarify or establish facts without necessarily creating obligations. Understanding these categories helps us see how Islamic law communicates with us and guides our actions. Throughout this presentation, we'll explore how these different hukum categories influence our daily lives and our relationship with Allah's commandments. Let's explore the distinction between Hukum Taklifi and Hukum Wadi. Hukum Taklifi is essentially about creating an obligation. It's aimed at making someone perform or refrain from an act, or sometimes giving them a choice between the two. Its main purpose is to influence behavior by establishing duties or permissions. On the other hand, Hukum Wadi doesn't have that goal. Instead, it serves more of an informational or explanatory role. It's used to clarify the relationship between different rules. For example, whether one rule is a cause, a condition, or an obstacle for another. It can also help determine whether an act is valid or void, providing criteria for judgment. Now, the key difference lies in their scope of influence. Hukum Taklifi directly affects actions that are within a person's ability, meaning it targets acts they can perform or avoid. Hukum Wadi, however, influences understanding and relationships between rules, and might concern acts that the person can or cannot do, but it doesn't impose a direct obligation. So, in summary, Hukum Taklifi is about obligation and choice, forcing or enabling action, whereas Hukum Wadi is about understanding, relationships, and criteria. This distinction helps us see how legal and religious rules function differently, either to guide behavior or to clarify the structure of rules themselves. Let's delve into the Hukum Taklifi, or obligation and duty, and see how it is viewed from two important perspectives in Islamic law. First, there's the usul perspective, which comes from specialists in usul al-fiqh, the roots of Islamic jurisprudence. From this point of view, the Hukum Taklifi is defined as the demand of the lawgiver, meaning God, that requires a person to either perform an act, omit an act, or sometimes gives the person a choice between doing or not doing it. Now, shifting to the perspective of the faqih, who specializes in fiqh or substantive law, this view focuses on the legal attribute of the act itself after the lawgiver's demand. It looks at whether the act is legally required, prohibited, or permissible, and whether the person has a choice in the matter. These two perspectives are more than just different angles. They actually influence the specific terminology used in usul al-fiqh. Understanding both helps us grasp the full scope of how obligations are conceptualized and applied in Islamic law, which is essential as we explore the broader principles of Islamic legal theory. Now, let's explore the Hukum Teklifi according to the Sunni majority. This concept encompasses different levels or categories of rulings that Allah has established. First, we have obligation, or ijab, which signifies what is wajib, things we are required to do. Then there's recommendation, or nadibi, indicating actions that are encouraged but not compulsory. Disapproval, or karaha, refers to actions that are disliked but not sinful. Prohibition, tarim, covers those acts that are forbidden and should be avoided. Moving on, we encounter permissibility, or ibaha, which means actions that are neither encouraged nor prohibited. They are neutral or allowed. Now, within these categories, we have specific terms for the strength of these rulings. For example, obligatory or wajib emphasizes the duty to perform certain acts. Recommended or mandab highlights actions that are virtuous but not obligatory. Disapproved or makruh points to actions that are better avoided, though not sinful. Prohibited or haram are actions that are strictly forbidden. And permissible or mubah refers to things that are completely allowed without any sin or reward involved. From the perspective of faqih, the focus is on emphasizing the performance of the duty created by the hukum, so the emphasis is on ensuring the obligation is fulfilled. Conversely, from the perspective of usuli, the emphasis is on understanding the obligation itself, recognizing what our duties are according to the principles of usul al-fiqh. This distinction helps us see how different scholars and approaches prioritize the understanding and implementation of these rulings within our overall framework of Islamic law. Now, let's take a closer look at the Hukum Teklifi according to the Hanafis. The Hanafis categorize obligations and duties into 7 different groups, which all emerge from the operation of law based on a single definition. These categories are quite important because they help us understand how obligations are structured within Islamic law. From the perspective of a faqih or Islamic jurist, the focus is often on how these duties are performed and fulfilled. So these 7 categories aren't just theoretical. They serve a practical purpose in guiding how Muslims carry out their religious obligations. This classification helps clarify what is obligatory, what is recommended, and what is permissible, all from a legal perspective. Understanding these categories is essential because they connect deeply with the overall theme of Islamic law's structure and the way it guides everyday actions. It shows us how law isn't just about rules, but about guiding a person towards the right conduct in a systematic way. Let's explore the concepts of fard and wajib, which are fundamental in understanding obligations. First, fard is considered obligatory, and this duty comes from a source of evidence that is definitive. That means the authenticity of the transmission is clear and unquestionable. When we say definitive, we mean there's no doubt about the credibility of the source. Moving on to wajib, it also means obligatory, but there's a slight difference. The demand for wajib is a bit weaker compared to fard because it arises from a source that is only probable regarding its authenticity. So, while it's still an obligation, the evidence isn't as absolute as in the case of fard. However, despite this lower level of certainty, wajib is expressed in binding terms. That means we are still required to act on it, even though the evidence is less definitive. Understanding these distinctions helps us grasp the hierarchy and strength of our duties in Islamic law, which is essential for applying them correctly in our daily lives. Now, let's explore 3 important categories of Islamic legal rulings related to acts and their level of obligation or disapproval. First, we have makruh karahat al-tanzi, which simply means disapproval. This category covers acts that are not outright forbidden but are still disliked. Crucially, the lawgiver demands that these acts be omitted based on probable evidence, but this evidence is expressed in non-binding terms. So, while it's not strictly prohibited, it's better to avoid doing them. Next is makra karahat altarim, which translates to reprehensible. Here, the evidence pointing to disapproval is stronger. It's expressed in binding terms, making it closer to prohibition. Acts falling into this category are more seriously discouraged, but they are not outright forbidden. The key difference from the previous category is the strength of the evidence and the binding nature of the demand. Finally, we have mandub, meaning recommended. This is slightly different because the act is encouraged, but the command to perform it isn't binding in the same way as obligations. The source of this recommendation is probable, but the demand is expressed in non-binding terms. So, it's something that's encouraged and viewed positively, but not obligatory. By understanding these categories, we see how Islamic law balances encouragement and disapproval based on the strength of evidence and the binding nature of commands. This helps us navigate what's recommended, discouraged, or prohibited in a nuanced way, which is essential for applying the law thoughtfully and accurately. Today, I want to talk about two important concepts in Islamic law regarding actions and their rulings. First, we have haram, which means prohibition or a duty not to commit a certain act. This is based on definitive evidence, meaning there is clear and conclusive proof that the act is forbidden. When something is haram, it's not just discouraged, it's a clear command not to do it, emphasizing its serious nature. On the other hand, we have mubah, which simply means permissible. Actions that fall under mubah are allowed, but importantly, no duty is created to perform them. The individual has the freedom to choose whether to do the act or not. This concept highlights personal choice and responsibility, giving us the flexibility to decide without any obligation. Understanding these distinctions helps us see how Islamic law categorizes actions based on clarity of evidence and moral obligation. It's a key part of the broader framework of Sharia, guiding us on what is forbidden, what is allowed, and what is neutral. Let's explore the meaning of wajib, or the obligator act. In its technical sense, wajib refers to an act that the lawgiver demands must be performed, and this demand is both certain and binding. Now, the nature of this demand can often be understood from how the statement is constructed, meaning the syntax or wording of the command itself. Sometimes, we can also infer it from external evidence beyond just the wording. For example, if there's a punishment for neglecting the act, that's a clear external indication that the act is obligatory. Think of acts like performing salat or paying zakat. These are classic examples of wajib acts. They are not optional. They are mandated by the law, and the consequences of neglecting them are well understood. So, in essence, wajib acts are those that the law explicitly requires, and this requirement can be identified either through the language used or through external signs like punishment. Connecting this to the broader theme, understanding what makes an act wajib helps us grasp the importance of following religious obligations carefully and conscientiously. Now let's discuss the hukum or rule of wajib. According to the Sunni majority, when something is wajib, it means it must be done by the individual. If you do it, there is not only a reward or thawab from Allah, but also a sense of fulfillment of your religious duty. On the other hand, if someone omits wajib actions without a valid legal excuse, they face a penalty, which highlights the importance of fulfilling these obligations. It's also crucial to understand that if a person denies the legality of a wajib that is based on definitive, or kadi, evidence, meaning clear and undeniable proof, they are considered to be committing kufr or infidelity. This underscores how serious the matter is when it comes to the core acts of worship and their legal rulings. So, in the broader context of our presentation, understanding the hukum of wajib helps us appreciate the significance of fulfilling our religious duties and the consequences of neglecting them, especially when based on solid evidence. Today, let's discuss the hukum or rule of wajib and fard according to the Hanafis. The fard, which is the absolute obligation, is established through definitive or kadi evidence. When something is considered fard, it means performing it is mandatory, and there is a clear legal requirement backing this. The rule for fard is that if you omit it, you are liable to punishment, and there is even an imputation of kufr or disbelief, which makes its legal validity very strict. For example, the 5 daily prayers, zakat, and hajj are all considered fard. On the other hand, wajib is established through probable or zani evidence. This means the evidence isn't as definitive, but it strongly suggests obligation. The rule for wajib is also that performance is obligatory, and there is liability for punishment if omitted. However, the gravity of neglect isn't as severe as with fard. Importantly, if someone denies a wajib, it doesn't necessarily mean they are committing kufr, unlike with fard. Examples of wajib include sadakat al-fitr and witr prayer. So, to summarize, the key difference lies in the type of evidence that establishes each and the severity of the consequences for neglect. Both are essential components of our religious duties, but they differ in their evidentiary basis and legal implications. Let's take a closer look at the classification of wajib, or obligatory acts, based on different criteria. One important way to classify wajib is by the time available for its performance. When we talk about wajib mutlaq, or unrestricted wajib, we're referring to acts that the lawgiver demands be performed, but without setting a specific time frame. For example, paying kafara or making a nadr for fasting in the future are considered wajib mutlaq. The key point here is that the person has the flexibility to perform these acts whenever they find it convenient, without any fixed deadline. This flexibility is important because it means the obligation remains until fulfilled, but there's no pressure of a strict time limit. The rule for wajib mutlaq is simply that the individual can carry out the act at any time they choose. Understanding this helps us see how different obligations are managed within Islamic law, giving us clarity on when and how we should fulfill them, aligning with the overall theme of understanding the classification and proper performance of obligatory acts. Wajib muqayyad, which is also called wajib muakkad, literally means limited by time. It refers to an obligatory act that the lawgiver requires from us, but with a specific time frame. That means there is a clear beginning and end to when this act should be performed. For example, the 5 daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, and hajj are all wajib muqayyad. These acts are mandatory, but they also have set periods during which they must be carried out. Now, it's important to understand that wajib muqayyad has its subdivisions. The first one is called tajil, which means performing an obligatory act early, but only if the lawgiver permits it. For example, paying sadakat al-fitr early is considered tajil. It's a way of performing the act ahead of its designated time, but only within the bounds allowed by Islamic law. So, in essence, wajib muqayyad helps us understand the importance of timing in our obligations, ensuring we fulfill them within the prescribed periods, but also allowing some flexibility when permitted. Ada is all about the timely performance of an act. It's when you do something exactly within the time that the lawgiver has set for it. The key point here is that there should be no shortfall, no delay or rushing beyond that specified time. It emphasizes precision and adherence to the prescribed timing. On the other hand, qada refers to performing an obligatory act after its designated time has passed. For example, if someone offers the morning prayer after the sun has already risen, that would be considered qada. It highlights the importance of completing acts within their proper time frame, but also recognizes that sometimes they might be performed later than scheduled. Connecting this to our overall theme, understanding the difference between ada and qada helps us appreciate the importance of not only fulfilling our duties, but doing so at the right time. It's about respecting the instructions given by the lawgiver and maintaining discipline in our acts of worship and other obligations. Wajib mudayak, or obligatory acts with a specific time limit, are those acts where the time given is just enough to perform the act once, and no more. For example, fasting during Ramadan is considered wajib mudayak because you have a specific period to fast each day, and that period is just enough for the act itself. Next, we have wajib dihu shibhain, which means obligatory acts that have some extra time from one perspective, but are still limited from another. A good example here is hajj. You can perform hajj once in a year during the known months, but within that period, you are allowed to perform acts like tawaf multiple times. So, it gives some flexibility while still being confined within a certain time frame. Now, let's talk about the second subdivision of wajib muqayyad, which is wajib muwasa. This refers to obligatory acts where the allocated time is sufficient not only for the act itself, but also for performing other similar acts. An example here is the time allocated for zuhr prayer. You have enough time to perform zuhr and also to perform other acts related to it, giving you some extra room to complete your obligations comfortably. Understanding these distinctions helps us see how different acts are structured in terms of timing, and it connects to the overall theme of balancing obligation and flexibility in worship and duties. Now, let's look at the second classification based on the extent of the required act. First, we have wajib muhaddad, or the determinate obligatory act. This refers to acts where the lawgiver has clearly specified the amount or extent. A good example of this is the 5 daily prayers, where the number and timing are fixed. The key point here is that as soon as the cause of this obligation is established, it immediately becomes a liability. In other words, once the conditions are met, the obligation is due without any delay. Next, we have wajib ghayr muhaddad, the indeterminate obligatory act. These are acts where the lawgiver has not fixed a specific amount or extent. For example, spending in the way of Allah or feeding the needy fall into this category. The important concept here is that these acts do not automatically become liabilities unless they are imposed through a judicial decision, or if the person willingly accepts the obligation. So, in this case, the obligation depends on willingness or formal imposition, making it more flexible compared to the determinate acts. Connecting these points to our overall theme, understanding the difference between these two types helps us grasp how obligations are structured and enforced within Islamic law, depending on whether the act's extent is fixed or flexible. Now, let's look at the first classification based on the subject who is required to perform the act. This is called wajib aini, which means the universal obligatory act. Essentially, it refers to obligations that are demanded by the lawgiver from every individual who has the legal capacity to perform them. Examples of these are prayers, fasting, hajj, and zakat. The key point here is that these obligations are personal. Each person who is required to fulfill them must do so themselves. It's not enough if someone else performs the act on their behalf. The rule for this type of obligation is clear. It must be performed by each individual from whom it is demanded. And an important aspect to remember is that the individual remains liable for the act. Even if someone else performs the obligation on their behalf, they are still personally responsible and not absolved from liability. This classification highlights the personal responsibility each of us holds when it comes to these fundamental acts of worship and duty. It's a core part of understanding how obligations are assigned and fulfilled within our faith. Today, I want to talk about the concept of wajib kafeh, which is known as the communal obligatory act. This is a special kind of obligation where the performance is demanded from the entire community, rather than from each individual personally. For example, think of acts like jihad, responding to someone's salam, or rendering testimony. These are responsibilities that, if some members of the community fulfill them, then the rest are no longer liable. In other words, once the required act is performed by any members of the community, the obligation is considered fulfilled for everyone. This concept emphasizes the importance of collective responsibility. It's not about everyone doing the same thing, but about the community as a whole ensuring these acts are carried out. Understanding wajib kafeh helps us see how communal duties are balanced with individual responsibilities, which is a key part of our overall discussion on Islamic obligations and community cohesion. Now, let's move on to the next classification, which is based on the identification of the specific object of the required act. Here, we focus on what we call wajib muayyan, or the specified obligatory act. Essentially, this means that the obligation is tied to a particular act that must be performed. There's no option or choice involved when it comes to what needs to be done. For example, when we talk about prayers or fasting, these are clear-cut actions that are specifically prescribed. The key point to remember is that the individual is not free from liability unless they perform the exact act required. In other words, the obligation isn't flexible or open to interpretation. It's about fulfilling a specific, defined act. This classification helps us understand that some duties are clearly mandated and must be carried out in a precise way to meet the religious or legal requirements. Wajib mukhyar, or the unspecified obligatory act, refers to a type of obligation that isn't tied to a single specific act. Instead, it's a requirement where one has multiple options to fulfill it. For example, when it comes to kafara or expiation, for breaking an oath, there are several ways to do so. You can feed 10 needy persons, clothe them, or even free a slave. The key point here is that if you're unable to perform one of these options, you are allowed to choose another. And once you've performed any one of these acts, you are considered to have fulfilled the obligation and are absolved of any further liability. This concept highlights flexibility within certain religious duties, making it easier for individuals to fulfill their responsibilities when faced with constraints. It connects to the broader theme of understanding different types of obligations and the ways to approach them in accordance with Islamic teachings. Today, we're going to discuss the concept of mandab, also known as mandab ilay. This term refers to a specific type of recommendation in Islamic law. Essentially, it's a demand by the lawgiver to perform an act, but it's important to understand that this demand is non-binding. That means there's no penalty if you choose not to do it, and it's not considered sinful to omit it. The key point here is that mandab is based on evidence that suggests the act is recommended. This evidence can take different forms. Sometimes, it's a clear text from the Quran or Hadith, or it can be a general principle within the Sharia. Other times, it's an indirect indication, like the absence of any penalty for not performing the act. To illustrate this, let's look at an example from the Quran. It says, "O ye who believe, when you enter into a transaction involving a debt, write it down." Quran 282 now, this instruction to write down the debt is a recommendation. It's not obligatory, but it's highly encouraged, based on the evidence indicating its benefit. So, in summary, mandab acts are acts that the lawgiver recommends but does not obligate us to perform. They're supported by evidence that suggests they're good or beneficial, but their omission doesn't carry any blame or penalty. This concept helps us understand the flexibility within Islamic law and how recommendations fit into our overall practice. Let's look at the key evidence from the verse in the Quran, specifically verse 283. It states that if one of you deposits something in trust with another person, the trustee is responsible for faithfully discharging that trust. What this highlights is the importance of trustworthiness in financial dealings. Interestingly, the verse suggests that the debtor can be trusted without necessarily having a written record of the debt. This emphasizes the value of integrity and honesty over formal documentation alone. Overall, this aligns with the broader theme of our presentation, which is about ethical principles in financial transactions. It underscores that trustworthiness and moral responsibility are fundamental, sometimes even more important than formal paperwork. Now let's talk about the first type of mandab, which is sunnah muakkada, or the emphatic recommended act. This refers to actions that are highly encouraged and were consistently performed by the Prophet, peace be upon him. These are not just optional, they carry a strong recommendation. The Prophet, peace be upon him, was persistent in performing these acts, showing their importance. However, it's worth noting that he didn't perform every recommended act all the time. There were some occasions when he might have missed them. But overall, his persistence highlights how significant these acts are for us as Muslims. Understanding this helps us see the value placed on consistent good actions and encourages us to follow his example by maintaining these recommended acts as much as we can. Remember, these acts strengthen our faith and bring us closer to Allah, so making an effort to incorporate them into our routine is truly beneficial. This slide explains that there are two types of acts related to sunnah muakkada. These acts are those that complement and complete what is wajib, or obligatory. For example, adhan, which is the call to prayer, and congregational prayers, which are highly emphasized in Islam. The key point here is that if someone neglects these acts, they are not committing a major sin, but they are still liable to some blame. It's important to understand that this blame does not reach the level of punishment, but it's a reminder that neglecting sunnah mu'akkada is not recommended. On the other hand, performing these acts is highly rewarded in the hereafter. Allah rewards those who uphold and practice these sunnah acts, recognizing their effort and devotion. However, if someone completely abandons these acts, it can affect their moral probity, or adala. This moral integrity is crucial in many aspects of a person's life, including the credibility of their testimony. Losing adala can lead to the rejection of their testimony, which shows how important these acts are in maintaining personal integrity within Islamic teachings. In summary, while neglecting sunnah mu'akkada may not be punishable, it's still considered blameworthy, and performing them brings reward. Complete abandonment can have serious implications on one's moral standing. Today, I want to talk about a specific category of sunnah mu'akkada. These are actions that, while highly recommended, do not actually complement or complete a wajib, meaning they are not obligatory in themselves. However, they are generally supportive of the obligatory acts, which means they help strengthen our overall practice and devotion. For example, one such act is praying 2 rakas before the Fajr prayer. This is a sunnah mu'akkada because it's emphasized and recommended, but it's not considered essential to the validity of the prayer itself. Now, there is a reward for performing these acts, and there is a blame or a sense of disfavor for giving them up. But it's important to understand that if someone chooses not to perform these sunnah acts, they do not lose their adala, their integrity or their standing in faith. So, in essence, these sunnah are meant to support us and enhance our worship, not to be a source of guilt if we leave them out occasionally. They serve as a beautiful way to earn reward and get closer to Allah, but their absence does not compromise our overall faith or righteousness. Today, I want to talk about sunnah or mu'akkada, which are the non-emphatic recommended acts in our faith. These are actions that are encouraged but not obligatory, meaning the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not perform them consistently or persistently. For example, performing the 4 rakas before Asr and Isha prayers, or giving sadaqah to the poor. These acts are commendable and bring reward, but they are not mandatory. The key point here is that if someone performs these acts, they will earn thawab or reward, but if they choose not to, they are not to be blamed or considered sinful. This distinction helps us understand the flexibility in our worship and encourages us to engage in good deeds without feeling burdened. Connecting this to the overall theme, it reminds us that our faith encourages us to do good, but also respects our capacity and circumstances. Today, I want to talk about the concept of sunnah zawid. This term is used by some jurists to describe the actions of the Prophet that relate to everyday human activities. For example, things like his dress, his food and drink, and how he interacted with his family members. These are not necessarily worship acts, but they reflect his way of life in normal daily tasks. The key point here is that if someone adopts these actions out of love for the Prophet, and with the intention of following his example, they are rewarded for doing so. It's about emulating his lifestyle in a genuine and heartfelt way. However, it's important to understand that if someone chooses not to adopt these acts, they are not blameworthy. There is no sin or fault in not following these particular actions, as they are not obligatory. This concept ties into the broader theme of our presentation, which emphasizes following the Prophet's example in ways that show love and respect, while also understanding the difference between what is recommended and what is mandatory. Let's explore the meaning of haram, or a prohibited act. Essentially, a prohibited act is one that the lawgiver requires us to omit, and this requirement is made clear and binding. Now, according to the majority of jurists, known as jumhur, it doesn't really matter whether the evidence telling us about this omission is definitive, meaning absolutely certain, or just probable, meaning likely but not certain. Both types of evidence are considered sufficient for establishing what is prohibited. However, the Hanafis have a slightly different perspective. They believe that if the evidence is definitive, then the act is clearly haram. But if the evidence is probable, then it falls into a category called makra karahat at tarim, which means it's more like an abominable act that is closer to being prohibited but not quite. Understanding these nuances helps us see how different schools of thought approach the concept of prohibition, which ties into the broader theme of how Islamic law guides us in distinguishing between what is permissible and what is not. The rule for the prohibited act is quite specific. It involves the imputation of kufr, or disbelief, to the person who denies its legal validity. Essentially, if someone dismisses or rejects the established legal ruling of a prohibition, that act is considered problematic. However, this rule applies only when the prohibition comes from definitive evidence. In other words, when there's clear, conclusive proof backing the prohibition, the denial of that prohibition is seen as more serious. For example, there are certain acts that are universally recognized as prohibited based on solid evidence. These include eating carrion, which is dead meat not slaughtered properly, infanticide, or the killing of an infant, and unlawful sexual intercourse. Understanding this helps us see the importance of adhering to clear and established rulings in Islamic law, especially when they are based on definitive proof. It also highlights the gravity of denying such proven prohibitions, as it can lead to imputing disbelief. This connects to the broader theme of the presentation, emphasizing the importance of respect for established legal rulings and the consequences of denying them. Let's talk about the types of haram, specifically the ones that are prohibited for themselves, known as haram lidatihi. This means that the act itself is forbidden from the very beginning, independent of any external circumstances or categories. It's not something that becomes prohibited due to context. It's inherently forbidden. For example, acts like unlawful sexual intercourse, theft, and selling of carrion are all considered haram lidatihi. These are actions that, by their very nature, are prohibited. The key point here is that if someone commits such an act, there are no beneficial legal effects or gains that can come from it. For instance, unlawful sexual intercourse does not grant paternity rights or inheritance claims. The prohibition is absolute and rooted in the very act itself, not just in the consequences or external factors. Understanding this helps us see that certain acts are inherently wrong according to Islamic law, and that prohibition is clear from the outset. It's an essential part of understanding the overall framework of what is permitted and what is not in our religion. Today, I want to discuss a concept called haram ligarihi, which means prohibited for an external factor. Essentially, this refers to acts that were originally not forbidden and were, in fact, perfectly lawful in themselves. However, something outside the act intervened and made it prohibited. For example, fasting on Eid day is a good illustration. Fasting itself is generally allowed, but because of the external factor, specifically the significance of the Eid day, it becomes prohibited. The key point here is that, since the act is valid on its own, if we can remove the external factor that caused the prohibition, then the act could potentially be declared valid again. So, in summary, the prohibition in these cases depends on external circumstances, and as long as those circumstances change or are removed, the original act can regain its lawful status. This concept highlights the flexibility and context awareness in Islamic rulings, reminding us that external factors play a crucial role in determining what is permissible or prohibited. Let's explore the distinction between the two types of haram. First, when an act that is prohibited for itself becomes the subject of a contract, the contract is considered void. In other words, if the core act itself is forbidden, making it part of an agreement means that the entire contract cannot be valid. On the other hand, if the act is prohibited due to external factors, such as societal or legal reasons, and then it becomes the subject of a contract, the contract isn't automatically void. Instead, it is vitiated, meaning it has partial or suspended legal effect. So, such a contract may be considered invalid or limited in its enforceability, but it doesn't automatically disappear. Now, regarding acts that are prohibited for themselves, these can generally only be permitted in cases of duress or idtirar. For example, alcohol is prohibited on its own, and normally it cannot be permitted. But if someone is dying of thirst and there's no other option, then in that extreme situation, it may be permitted out of necessity. Similarly, acts that are prohibited due to external factors, like certain activities forbidden by law or social norms, may be permitted in cases of dire need, but only to the extent that the necessity requires. Once that need is fulfilled, the prohibition remains in place. This distinction is crucial because it helps us understand how Islamic law approaches different kinds of prohibitions, especially when balancing legality and necessity. Let's talk about the meaning of makruh, which is often translated as a disapproved act. According to the Jumhur, or the majority view, makruh is considered a single category. It simply refers to an act whose omission is demanded by the lawgiver, even if that demand is non-binding. This means that, regardless of the evidence type, the law encourages us to avoid this act by not doing it. Essentially, makruh is an act where it's better not to do it at all. It's preferable to leave it out rather than perform it. For example, there's a verse in the Quran that clearly proscribes selling during the time of the Friday prayer. It advises believers to avoid engaging in sales at that specific time. So the key point here is that makruh helps us distinguish between acts that are simply disliked and those that are clearly discouraged by the law, guiding us to avoid them for the sake of righteousness. This concept ties into our overall understanding of Islamic ethics and the importance of mindful actions. Makruh, however, is divided by the Hanafis into two types. The first type is makruh tahriman, which is considered reprehensible because it is closer to the category of haram. This means that although it is not outright forbidden, it is strongly discouraged and carries a sense of disapproval. This type of act is the opposite of wajib, which is obligatory. It refers to acts that the lawgiver has indicated should be avoided through probable evidence, such as making a marriage proposal when another proposal is already waiting for a response. The hukum, or ruling, for this type of makruh is that there can be punishment for the person who denies it, but it is important to note that they are not considered to be kafir or outside the fold of Islam. The second type is makruh tenzilan, which the majority of scholars agree on, and it has the same basic definition of makruh as we discussed earlier. This category is generally viewed as less severe, but still something to avoid. Both types help us understand the nuances within makruh, emphasizing that not all makruh acts are equally serious. Recognizing these distinctions is important as we consider how Islamic law guides our actions and behaviors, especially in relation to what is recommended and what is discouraged. Now, let's look at the meaning of mubah, or permitted act. The mubah is essentially a category where the lawgiver gives us the choice to do or not do something. Importantly, there's no blame if we choose to omit or do the act. It's neither praised nor condemned. That's why it's also called halal, meaning permissible. When we refer to mubah in texts, it's often expressed with phrases like, "there is no harm for you," or "it is no sin for you," indicating that the action is allowed. Another key point is that mubah is also understood through the principle of istishab. This principle states that anything not explicitly prohibited or considered abominable by Sharia remains permissible. So, applying this rule, we see that most contracts and transactions are permissible unless there's clear evidence to the contrary. This understanding helps us see the broader picture of what's allowed in everyday life and transactions, aligning with the overall theme of balanced and permissible actions in Islam. Thank you.